Section 3.1 Transferring the theory of change to a logical framework matrix and identify the indicators. Here you have your logical framework matrix, which is in fact only a table. A table where you have in the first column your results and then the indicators, and regarding these indicators you will have a baseline, meaning from where are we departing our monitoring, from where are we starting the monitoring of this indicator, and then you have a target, which is then the objective that you want to achieve with your intervention. You want to control if you achieve a certain target. Then source of verification, meaning that we want to know which type of data you're going to use to set up the indicator, and then the assumptions that we have spoken about during the theory of change development, assumptions about how you're going to achieve the results. Impact indicators are measures of the longer term and more widespread development changes in the society or economy or environment to which the project contributes. Often these are captured via natural sector or subsector statistics, like reductions in percent of populations living below the poverty line, or declines in infant mortality rates, or reductions in urban pollution emission rates. With indicators, we mean the goal of the project and the domains of change that you can also now call purposes if you are targeting those specifically. If you are targeting such a couple of domains of change, those that you are targeting in your theory of change graphic, those you can call purposes, don't forget. Then we have the outcome indicators, which measure relatively direct and short to medium term effects of project outputs on the next users, meaning the intermediary organizations like the extension services, or even directly on the project beneficiaries, the end users like the farmers or some community that is needing the project intervention. The outcomes were formulated as underlying conditions, behavioral or systemic nature in the problem tree, if you remember. We can have different types of outcomes. We can have immediate outcomes, intermediate outcomes, and ultimate outcomes. Immediate outcomes are the initial changes in the skills or knowledge, abilities, or awareness, sometimes even access of populations profit in the very short term from the project interventions. Examples are the number of project trainees or extension officers who score well on a test, the number of farmers that have attended training. Intermediate outcomes measure changes in behavior, practices, and performance on next users or end users, and they are a consequence of the immediate outcomes. For example, percentage of total health institutions provided gender-sensitive services now to ethnic populations in their language of choice. So this is something that proves out of the enhancement of the capacity of the services, of the immediate outcomes of your project. So these are intermediate outcomes of the project as a result of the changes that you have caused in the services, the positive changes of enhancing their capacities. Ultimate outcomes, they measure the sustainable changes in the lives of the beneficiaries as a consequence of the intermediate outcomes. They are more in the long term. For example, average annual incomes of small farmers in a certain region from all sources of their livelihood. Output indicators, physical quantities of what you have delivered, a model for water accounting or a water treatment plant, or other goods and services produced by the project, like the number of children attending project schools or the number of farmers attending project demonstrations. These project demonstrations are outputs of your project. Outputs may have not only quantity but also quality dimensions as well, like the percent of highways completed that meet specific technical standards. So the quality issue here is the specific technical standards that are being achieved completing those highways. So this would be also an output, not only the fact that the highway is physically being completed, but also that these parts of the highway comply with specific technical standards. Activity indicators, they measure what happens during the implementation of the project, during the production of the outputs. The indicators can be expressed as milestones, meaning that during the course of these activities, certain milestones are achieved that allows you then to be sure or to be more secure that the output's going to be produced successfully. For example, the date by which an hydrological model starts being calibrated after data has been collected, after the model has been programmed, then the model is finished, it's still not finished, it's going to be calibrated. So the calibration point, it is a milestone of this activity of producing an hydrological model. Input indicators are normally not used, but just for the sake of completeness, I'll introduce them to you here. So these are the quantities needed to set the activities on, to start with the activities, to continue with the activities. So these are measures of quantities of physical, human, or financial resources that are needed to accomplish the activities, to accomplish the outputs. They normally only show up in the budget calculations. There are certain very important characteristics for building good indicators, and they are called SMART criteria. An indicator should be specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound. By specific, we mean we need to define unambiguously and precisely what the indicator is measuring. By measurable, we mean that we need to provide a measurement construct, like the indicator must have somehow a quantitative measure or description of qualitative conditions. A departure from a baseline. We need to measure it from the baseline on, and we need to provide methods of data collection or sources of verification of this indicator. With achievable, we mean it should be possible to reach the target value that we are giving for this indicator. The indicator has a baseline and then it has a target. So it is achievable if the target is reasonable. It is a reasonable value of the indicator given the available resources and the prevailing condition. It must be relevant, meaning that the information provided by the indicator should be of relevance to describing the outcomes and outputs. And it should as well be time-bound. Of course, we cannot have an indicator that does not give us any indication about the period of accountability or the period of monitoring. Let's see some examples of, let's say, non-SMART outcome indicator formulations. Given the outcome, let's say the transportation sector contributes to achieving the national mitigation targets. An example of a non-SMART outcome indicator in this example will be the transportation sector's mitigation potential is increased. What is wrong here? For example, the specific criterion is not met. Specific means that it needs to be defined unambiguously and precisely. Like I've said before, the indicator must be clearly and precisely defined and the outcome must be appropriately represented. In this case, the information is imprecise because it is not possible to determine the baseline and target value in terms of the transportation sector's mitigation potential. It is not clear what the intended change is, and therefore the change is also not measurable. So there are different problems with this indicator, but one of those, and the most serious one, is the specificity of the indicator, which is not given. Let's see another example of an indicator for the same outcome, but it's still a non-SMART one. By February 2017, several, meaning national adaptation and mitigation actions, have been developed for the transportation sector. Here you have an example of the measurable criterion which is not met. The proposed indicator is not measurable because the description, several, is subjective and not a concrete value is given. In addition, there is no reference value against which to measure the change. Again, no baseline. An improvement out of that indicator will be that by December 2015, 10 NAMAs, National Adaptation Mitigation Actions, have been developed for the transportation sector. Now, the measurability is given and also the target, by December 2015, but the achievability criterion is not met. Remember, with achievable, we meant it should be possible to reach the target value of the indicator with the available resources and under the prevailing conditions. So the target must realistically be achieved within the context of the project with the available resources. Given this, targets should be formulated in relation to the project's capacity and the local conditions. When determining the target level at the outset of the project, the local conditions should be assessed in terms of what target could realistically be achieved within the context of the project with the available resources. That's what is meant by this. Even though ambitious project goals are generally viewed positively, demanding targets should be formulated in relation to the capacity of the project teams. And definitely 10 NAMAs seems like a very high number, given that a country only normally can have one or two for one or two sectors. Let's see another formulation of the same indicator. By February 2017, data on greenhouse gas emissions in the transportation sector will be collected and assessed with regard to the mitigation potential. The relevant criterion is not met here. And why? Because the indicator should provide relevant information with regard to achieving the outcome. In this case, the indicator is related to activities that are needed for the preparation and development of a NAMA and would therefore be appropriate for measuring results at the output level and not at this outcome level. Another formulation of an indicator. 3 NAMAs have been developed for the transportation sector in cooperation with partners. So the time-bound criteria is not met here. The indicator should clearly define the time by which the target value should be achieved, and this is not the case here. So another example where one of the criteria is not met. Now you have a formulation of, finally, a smart formulation of the outcome indicator. By February 2017, 3 NAMAs have been developed for the transportation sector in cooperation with partners. So it is specific, you are exactly denominating what you are measuring. It is measurable because it gives you a number which you can compare with. 3 NAMAs, it is achievable. 3 NAMAs for a sector of the economy are quite reasonable. It is measurable as well. You can measure at the end of the period that was given. You can measure how many NAMAs were delivered or not. It is relevant because of the NAMAs. They are relevant for measuring this outcome, of course. And it is time-bound. It is giving the time to have it ready by February 2017. So you have a baseline of 0 at the time that the project starts. You still don't have any NAMA. At the end of the project, you should have 3. And the sources of verification are the availability of the 3 developed NAMAs, of course. For finalizing, you have here some more examples on how to formulate indicators. For example, here for this impact, increased public participation in national and local elections, particularly by women, indigenous populations, and other traditional marginalized groups. So this is a high-level outcome at the level of the impacts already. An indicator will be the overall proportion of eligible voters who vote in the national or local elections, and the baseline will be then 42% was the case in 2006, and in 2010 it should be 70%. So the target that we are aiming at will be 70%, and means of verification will be the offices for electoral administrations and the final reports on the elections. So this is an example on how should you construct an indicator. Here you have other indicators now for other outcomes and also for an output here. So that's it about this part of the lecture. Thank you very much and see you next time.